I'm not suggesting everybody use AI or they incorporate AI, but everybody needs to understand AI. We need a level of information literacy, AI literacy, and some fluency with AI that we really haven't seen yet. And most people really haven't been able to grapple with that yet. So even if somebody's planning on not using AI in their classroom, they better understand it well enough to know how students might try to use it or what they're going to be doing with it or how they might need to use it in their intended field a little bit later. So we've got to work on AI literacy and really raise that foundation first.
Hi, welcome to the second episode of What Matters Most at the University of Mary Washington. I'm your host, Troy Pano, president here at the University of Mary Washington. And today I have an incredibly special guest. I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since I heard that we booked him. He is one of our all-star professors here at the University of Mary Washington. Hopefully many of our listeners know of him and have had an opportunity to hear from him in a variety of occasions. He's one of our public intellectuals, Professor Anand Rao, who is a professor of communication and digital studies. He's been in higher education now for over 20 years, I believe, about 23.
About 30.
Almost 30, okay, wow. Currently serves as the director for the Center for AI and the Liberal Arts at the University of Mary Washington, and we will ultimately get to that in our conversation today. His work integrates artificial intelligence with humanities education, emphasizing critical thinking and debate as essential tools for navigating technological change. Welcome to What Matters Most.
Great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for that very generous introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, you've accomplished a lot in your career, and that introduction could go on, but I would like us to begin just sort of broadly for you to introduce yourself to our listeners. Why don't you just tell them a little bit about your journey to higher education, your professional journey, and what has brought you here?
Sure. It's always interesting for me to think about what led me to education. My sisters and I, one of three kids, we all ended up in education, and we didn't have any other family members in education. But I think it's just something that our family obviously really valued. Our parents were very supportive of our different educational journeys. For me, when I was a high school student and in college, I was a member of the debate team. Philosophy major, and I figured, as most debaters, I'd go pro and become a lawyer, because that's what most debaters ended up doing. And I was planning on doing that, but I was engaged at the time during my senior year, and my fiance had one more year of her 5-year program. So my debate coach said, well, why don't you stick around for a year, and you can coach debate. We can give you an assistantship. It'll be paid for. You can teach a class and coach debate, get a master's, and then you can go to law school after. It was a pretty good deal. And so I tried that out, and I remember teaching for the first time, and I still remember vividly teaching, and it was just a month after I graduated undergraduate. But I was teaching an argumentation and debate class, my own class, but I felt very comfortable with it, given that I'd been debating for years, and I loved it. I was just really inspired. I loved being in the classroom. And so I kept thinking, okay, eventually I'll go to law school. I'll finish the master's. Okay, well, actually, the PhD looks pretty great. I'll do that. And then I just pulled into academia and have enjoyed it ever since. Have always been very interested in legal questions. My dissertation was on legal admissibility of scientific evidence. I was always interested in the way debate components would play out in discussions with science and technology. But I really found that I loved inspiring students, working with students, and building out kind of this model for debate. And that's what inspired, obviously, my entry into academia and so much of the work that I've done in academia. A lot of it is based on the idea that we value diversity because we want to hear other perspectives and ideas. A good debate means that I'm able to hear somebody else's perspective that I haven't anticipated. Now, in a competitive debate, I want to anticipate it because I want to win that debate. But more importantly, I want to make sure that I can take that perspective and incorporate it into the ideas that I have, and that'll result in a better idea, hopefully. And I've always enjoyed that. So I really love recruiting students into my argumentation class that have very different political beliefs than I do. And I remember early on being very transparent. Here are my political beliefs. I love that you have different political beliefs. Let's get you in from the college political group and have you be part of this, because I think we'll have a really good discussion about this, and I think we'll both learn something from it. So that's informed pretty much everything that I've done in academia. It's the reason I really enjoy being part of an academic community, because we have those conversations, we have those debates, we test ideas, and we do it in a respectful way. But we can push each other pretty hard. And that has really kind of set the scene for me in everything I've done in academia. And now with the work I'm doing in AI, I think it's really instructed that work too.
Boy, we need it now more than ever.
Yes.
So that's great. I want to hear a little bit more about your Mary Washington journey. You've been here at Mary Washington since when?
Since 2002. Yes,
Okay.
yeah. So I was a faculty member at another school in Pennsylvania for 7 years. I was actually tenured. I was director of the program, speech and debate program there. I wasn't really planning on leaving and giving up tenure to go to another school, but I heard about a position here. And I always knew about Mary Washington. I had actually qualified for nationals in debate in college at Mary Washington.
Oh,
The
really?
qualifier was held here my senior year. My family came and watched, so they'd even come to the campus. And I'd always coached against Mary Washington debaters, so I knew how smart the students were. I was good friends with the debate coach at the time, Tim O'Donnell, who's now provost, and he told me about the position. And I thought, well, if I were to leave, this is the kind of position I would leave for. And it was director of the speaking intensive program. So I came in 2002, and I've been here ever since. I've been working with the Speaking Intensive program for, I think, about 20 years, close to 20 years. I ran the Speaking Center for quite a while. I've worked with the First Year Experience program. I've worn a lot of different hats while I've been here, and then was also involved in founding the Department of Communication and Digital Studies and was chair of that department for 4 years.
Yeah, and that's, you've always been a leader here at Mary Washington. I've been here, I'm in my 10th year, it's hard to believe. And I knew of you even before I got here. And one of the things I've always appreciated about you is that you seem to be able to kind of look around the corner a little bit in terms of what's coming. And particularly, I know that you were instrumental in establishing now what is the Department of Communication and Digital Studies. Could you talk a little bit about the evolution into this? Because it's a very forward-thinking program that has become very popular here at Mary Washington.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that. It was interesting, but I remember interviewing for the job at Mary Washington in 2002, and the dean at the time told me, don't get any ideas. There will never be a communication degree or major at Mary Washington. And I was okay with that. I wasn't an undergraduate major in communication. I certainly appreciated communication courses. I loved studying communication. I was certainly okay with the special role that communication played in supporting the across the curriculum program, running speaking intensive, supporting the debate team, and then having a few special majors. Students have always had the opportunity at Mary Washington to develop a special major that's interdisciplinary in nature. So they would include courses in communication and rhetoric, and then courses in English perhaps, or maybe in environmental sciences and then my environmental rhetoric class. And they'd be able to put together something that was a really unique, inspired field of study that was particular to them. And I loved that because that meant that they were really passionate about what they were doing. I loved working with those students. So I would have a handful of majors, but not very many. It quickly became apparent, though, that there was greater demand than we ever anticipated. And so I'd been here for over 10 years, and we had a number of special majors, but we really didn't have any design to build that out in any particular way. But I think we reached a critical mass of students that were saying there really is more here. And I think part of it was the strength that both Tim and I had in our background in the study of rhetoric of science and technology, the understanding of digital studies. I was part of the group that helped put together the digital studies program initially as a minor, was teaching digital studies courses for quite a while. And it was also obvious that we needed to be able to incorporate more of those classes for students in a more intentional way. So part of it was just building out more courses, finding that there was demand, and then realizing we could just create another traditional communication program, but there are a lot of schools that do that, and they do that very well. But one thing that we found that we knew we could offer, and that was a really unique selling point for Mary Washington, was that we had this digital studies program that was gaining national prominence. And our communication courses were integrated into that program. And so it just made a lot of sense for us to think about how could we build out a major that would be a little more forward-thinking, not just thinking about traditional studies of communication, certainly providing that foundation. We've had lots of students that have gone on to graduate study and earned masters and PhDs in some of the best programs in the country in communication in a more traditional sense. But more of our students were also interested in interdisciplinary studies. And that's one thing that really was appealing to me. So when we first put together that proposal, it was an idea that, of course, we have to have a foundation in communication, study of rhetoric, some of those courses to make sure students have that foundation. But we also incorporated a few requirements of digital studies, and then a third of the credits were courses that were largely digital studies related courses, but they were across the curriculum. And there were a number of things about that that really appealed to me. It's that it reinforced this liberal arts perspective that we should have an interdisciplinary study, that students should have an appreciation for different perspectives and ideas. It also, from a personal level, and I was kind of selfish of me, I loved having a classroom full of students with different majors because we had different perspectives, different ideas. I wasn't just teaching to a dogmatic group, everybody singing with the same, in the same choir. It was a lot of different ideas and perspectives. Selfishly, I loved that. And so that was something we built into the program. The other thing I really loved about it is that I knew it would make our students distinct, because the nature of the communication digital studies major is one that, because it's interdisciplinary, not only is that distinct and it would help them stand out, it makes it a lot easier to double major. So many of our students will double major, and I encourage them to. And I always tell advisees, if there's any way to double major, just think about what you can do. At the very least, think about what you can tell an employer. Lots of people have majors. I have a double major. Let me talk to you about how these two different areas complement one another. So I have a business degree and I have a communication digital studies degree. That's hard to do at some schools. They don't make it easy. And we wanted to make that easy in a way that made sense for the discipline. So there's some business courses, marketing courses that fit within the major Comm Digital Studies. So instead of adding two 36-credit majors, it's like adding another major that's maybe 27 credits, and now you have a double major. It encouraged that interdisciplinarity. It encouraged different perspectives. It allowed for a better discussion in the class, and it made our students more marketable. So it certainly seemed like a winning solution.
No question. So you have, from my perspective, always been on the cutting edge and thinking about how new technologies can be integrated into teaching and learning, and being very thoughtful about how they're changing our lives. You're not alone in that. I know that there are other scholars here, and it's one of the things I really was impressed about Mary Washington, even before I got here, is that it is rooted in the liberal arts and sciences, but it is always evolving and thinking about not just today, but also the future world that our students are going to have to go work and live in. So I'm curious, has that always been the case for you? Were you always interested in technology, and were you always being thoughtful about how you're going to incorporate that into your teaching?
I think it was just kind of a natural inclination, probably inspired more from being raised by a dad who came to the U.S. in the early 60s and was always an early adopter. So he always was working on some new audio feature, always had a dark room that we were taking pictures and developing our own pictures. He was always taking movies in the early 70s and always thinking about what's the new technology, having an early video camera. And I remember hauling around a huge deck and a big camera as we were taking family trips. So it was always a matter of, let's test things out. Let's see what we could do with it. And so it wasn't even that intentional. I just kind of lucked into that household. And I think that certainly inspired it. My undergraduate and then graduate work in history and philosophy of science and then rhetoric of science was also thinking about, how do we consider these practices? How do we think about how technology changes society? Because it necessarily does. And it was really interesting to look at it from a philosophical perspective and then look at it from a rhetorical perspective, so that we could see, how is it that there are new perspectives that are developed? How do we change understanding about science and technology, both in pro-science and technology, and I'm very pro a lot of developments that are happening in science and technology, but also to make sure that we're critically looking at those and reflecting on those practices. And I don't think I've always gotten that right by any means. I was really concerned about social media and the way that I responded to social media early on. I think I was overly optimistic, and I started teaching in a social media class probably 20 years ago. And at that point, I think it was right after Facebook maybe came out, but a lot of people were still on MySpace or Friendster and, very early forms of social media. And at the time, I viewed the incredible potential for communities to be built, for people to connect. I was connecting with family members around the world through social media that I wasn't able to contact before very easily. And so I saw in the way that we would communicate that it had tremendous potential. I didn't really see exactly where that was going to go. And I really wasn't looking around the corner to see what was going to happen in 2016 with Cambridge Analytica, or the way that we become more siloed instead of actually breaking down some of those barriers. So I want to make sure that we're not making that same mistake now with artificial intelligence. And I think there are a lot of people that are sharing that same message. Let's be a little more critical about what's happening now. Not to say that we should stymie developments, that we should hold back, but let's make sure that we're doing it in a more thoughtful way to consider, what are the implications here. Let's not go into it. Let's make sure we're going into it open-eyed and really thinking about what are those practices and how can we do it in an intentional way. So I think I've always been an early adopter. I always love gadgets. I always love looking at new technologies. I want to make sure that I can kind of instill that wonder in our students, but also give them a critical toolkit so they can start thinking about, how do I want to employ this? Maybe it's not the way that the designers intended. Maybe it's not the way the companies are telling me that I can use it, but maybe I can find a better use that will actually benefit me and my community.
Oh, that's great. So I have been in higher education for a while myself. I was a lawyer earlier in my career, but I've been now in higher education, like you, for around 3 decades plus. And I was talking to my chief of staff right before I walked over here, and you know who he is, of course, Dr. Jeff McClurkin, who, like you, has been a scholar in digital pedagogies and digital humanities for him. And so I said, what should I ask him? And we had a conversation about, my experience at a variety of institutions before I came to Mary Washington is that with each new sort of technological innovation, there are ultimately two camps. There's the sort of utopian, that, hey, this is going to improve everything. And then there's the dystopia, those who think that this is the end of the world and we need to resist it. And I would say that probably some of the failings of those in higher education at some of my other institutions has been the resistance that somehow can we make this go away? And I think about through my own lifetime. When I was in college back in the 1980s, it was the big innovation was the personal computer. And I was one of the early adopters and had a personal computer in my dorm room, but I was an outlier. That was not common at that time. But over the course, you see the World Wide Web, the internet. In the 1990s, I was in graduate school at that time, and a lot of people both concerned but also excited about it. We think about, as you said, social media, the smartphone, all of these innovations. There have been these sort of opportunities but also challenges, and that brings us up to what I really want to talk to you about today that is on everyone's mind. That's artificial intelligence. Let's start with the Center for AI and the Liberal Arts. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how that came about and what its mission is.
Yeah, certainly. It's something that I feel very passionately about, and I think it's inspired by, for a long time I was studying artificial intelligence. We would talk about it in digital studies courses, but like everyone else, when ChatGPT came out in November of 22, it really knocked me on my heels. And I was both in awe of this technology and how you were able to interact with it so easily through a chat interface. And I could also see very easily that this is going to have a huge disruptive impact on education. It was readily apparent to me and close friends that we needed to try and get ahead of this. So I remember being part of a webinar just in January of 2023 to try and outline some strategies for other faculty. And we leaned, most of my friends and members of the research group have backgrounds in debate. We were all debaters. Many of us were debate coaches or still debate coaches. And it was really easy for us to think about, okay, how do we adapt to this question about authenticity, about assessment? What do we do if we're worried about students overusing or over-relying on this tool? Because we weren't viewing it as necessarily a bad or a good thing. It's just another tool that we need to figure out how to adapt to. And our initial impulse was to say, well, we already have a number of assessments that are available to us. It's something that I worked on for the Speaking Intensive program for 2 decades. We have oral communication across the curriculum, and we have many of our classes already include presentations with Q&A. Many of them include debates. And if there's ever a question as to whether or not students really learned content, you can tell that in a presentation with a good, robust Q&A, or even better in a debate, because there's no way you can fake your way through a debate. You just have to really have some facility with those arguments and understanding of how those arguments work. And so even if, in the worst case, somebody wrote their opening speech for them and they didn't write the paper that it's based on, if they still understand it well enough that they can debate well and they can educate the audience with those arguments, then I'm pretty comfortable as a faculty member that they've learned that content. And so that was something that we leaned into very early on. Let's talk about why we should go back to some of these traditional measures for assessment, some of these traditional means, going back to a tradition of orality, because that's not only something that will help us address the assessment concern and authenticity concerns. These are also the skills that we know are important for humanistic inquiry, that are going to be important for community building, and are increasingly important for success in an AI world. So that's really what kind of led me into this and to start working on it. And I think ever since I've just focused exclusively in this area, because I've started to uncover, and as I learn more, and that's one thing I love about being an academic, is you're always learning. You're always finding something new that you can learn about. And think of myself more as a student than an instructor in this area, because I'm always learning and always trying to meet somebody that is doing something that I haven't been exposed to yet. As I start to peel this back, and I'm gaining a better appreciation for just how disruptive this is going to be, and this is from early 23 until now, I start to see that this is obviously not just impacting initial assessments in the classroom. It's changing the nature of knowledge building. It's changing the nature of learning. It's going to change the nature of work and our interaction in society. And I think that these changes are going to continue to occur. And we have a little bit of time, but what really concerns me is that the rapidity with which these changes are occurring is just it spins my head. It's really hard to keep up with. And for all the time that I put into this, and I try to listen to a lot of futurists, people that are really analyzing the changes that are coming in society and the changes in technology and mapping that out, I really feel a mission to make sure that we can inform our students about these changes, make sure my colleagues know more about what's coming, and then we can start to develop some strategies on how we're going to adapt. And most importantly, I think for me, the question for all of this is, how do I make sure that I prepare my students for an AI world? And that is something that there are a lot of facets to that. It's not even just about making sure you can get a job, because I think it's going to be disruptive. It already is disruptive when we look at labor data that's occurring now. Recent college graduates are having a much harder time getting a job than they did in previous generations, previous years. And that's even with the stock market continuing to go up and other economic indicators suggesting that everything's fine and companies are growing. That's not happening the same way anymore. And so it's just a really different model for economic interaction. That's certainly part of it. But more than just getting a job, and that's obviously very important. That's existential. That's something where students need to have a means of employment. But they also need to figure out, what is this going to mean to the way we have civic discourse? What does this mean for some of the lessons we learned from social media, for the way we interact with one another, for misinformation, disinformation, the concerns about deepfakes, the concerns about how do we manage what we don't view as authentic anymore, but maybe is synthetic realities that are represented through content. All of those are concerns that we're only scratching the surface at this stage, but there's so much more that we need to delve into. So this has informed a lot of the discussions that we had early on, and I was involved with a number of faculty, and there were a lot of people on campus that have been working in this area. We had initial discussions about trying to start a center, and I was very fortunate to have a research sabbatical last year that I spent the entire year just focusing on this. I don't think I've ever been busier in my academic life. Sabbatical is supposed to be a little bit of a break, but I was attending a lot of conferences, trying to talk to a lot of industry experts, both in business and in technology, to find out more about what exactly is happening in this technology, how is it changing current business practices and industry practices. How can I bring that back into the classroom? And luckily, with the support of the administration and a lot of faculty, developing the center is a great starting point for that, to be able to provide support in a number of ways. First and foremost is to make sure that we can provide our students with better information, some educational opportunities to learn about these changes. Because while we assume that students are digital natives, we know that means that while they have some facility and they're exposed to a lot of things, that doesn't mean that they naturally have an understanding about how to critically reflect on those practices or to think about those in a historical context. So we're offering a number of courses. That's one area. Secondly, to provide support for our faculty, to be able to offer some webinars, to be able to bring in speakers for our faculty, and to be able to talk through, this is what's happening, this is how we see it changing some educational practices, here are some techniques or some ideas that you can explore. Not to dictate anything by any means for students or faculty, but to give them better information. We want to make sure that they're better informed about what's happening, what they might be able to do, and give them some suggestions about how to navigate all of this. And then I think the third component is really trying to provide some service to the local community so that we can share this information that we're gathering so that we can all navigate this together. I think we're part of a broader community. It's something that I always find resonates with my ideas in terms of developing arguments and having good, open, honest discussion and debate. We need to engage with the local community, share a lot of what we're doing with open sessions for speakers, public debates that we're hosting, different events, and then try to inform the local community so that they can help inform us about what the next steps will look like.
That's great. So we're going to jump a little bit more into AI. And some of our listeners are probably like me, still fairly novice, and hear a lot of talk about AI and large language models and generative AI. And some people are probably confused about what it even is and why it is so transformative. So could you just dumb it down for us, probably for my benefit more than our listeners, so that all understand exactly what we're talking about when we reference artificial intelligence?
It's a great question, and I'm certainly not more qualified than most to speak to this. I don't have a computer science background. I've just been trying to study this on my own for several years and talk to experts about this. There are a number of aspects of this that are really interesting to me. Part of it is this idea that we reference AI, but there's so much to the field of artificial intelligence that we sometimes kind of reference AI and we aren't really sure what we're referencing. So there's a really great book, AI Snake Oil, that came out, written by a professor at Princeton. Starts the first chapter with this little thought experiment and says, now imagine that we referenced every vehicle, whether it's a skateboard, bicycle, rocket ship, plane, car, as a vehicle. We don't have those other words. And every time we have a story about how vehicles are more energy efficient than ever before, we're like, but bicycles were always efficient. They don't use any energy. Or, there are more emissions now from vehicles, and we're thinking, well, how does riding a skateboard cause emissions? Because we're confused about the use of that term. It's the same thing with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence as a term, as an idea, has been around since the 50s. There was a Dartmouth conference in 1956 where that term was first used. It had been discussed well before that point, and there have been artificial intelligence algorithms and practices for decades. So it's not like ChatGPT was the first artificial intelligence by any means, but it is a subset of other forms of artificial intelligence, large language models. And this really has happened over the last 7 or 8 years. There was a new development, an architectural development called the Transformer. There was a really groundbreaking paper that was written in 2017, Attention is All You Need. And they laid out
Did that
this
come
claim.
out of Google? Was that a Google?
I think there were some members of a Google research team, yes, and also a number of people at the University of Toronto, Jeffrey Hinton, I
Yep.
think, and several others that were part of this publication. And what they really designed was this architecture that is well beyond my capabilities of understanding all of the implications of it, but it basically broke it down so that you could then build this architecture to train on tremendous amounts of data. And basically the entire internet and any book they can get a hold of, which raises a lot of the copyright concerns that we've heard about. But it would train on all of this data. It would figure out all of these connections and kind of think about neural connections and how do the words connect, how do they reference different things. And by doing that, then it is able to generate and predict word by word what it's going to respond with. So an important distinction, this is probably one of the most important distinctions when we think about large language models versus other digital technologies that we use, is that unlike Google or a database where it's recalling information, a large language model is generative. It's generating content. So it might reference something, but it's rarely going to, especially in its basic form without search functions, it's not going to recall specific language. It's going to generate language, word by word, that makes sense given what was asked of it and what context it's being written in. So I think that's a really important part for everybody to point to everybody to kind of start with, is this idea of generative AI as a subset of all of artificial intelligence. It's not the same as all the other artificial intelligence that we've interacted with or we hear about machine learning. There are lots of applications. But what has been really disruptive is this generative AI component, because there's more going on than a lot of the computer scientists even know. They can't directly trace what the actions are within the models when you have a prompt and it has an output. They can have some predictive value, but there's not a lot of transparency there. So it's a bit of this black box system where they aren't sure how it's coming up with what it comes up with. And it comes up with some amazing content. Sometimes it's hallucinating and it's making things up because it's thinking, well, sounds like what Troy wants to hear. He's asking about a court case that refers to this. So I'll tell him about a court case that refers to that, even though that court case doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. It's generating text that makes sense given what you've asked about. That is an important component of this. Now, they've built out a lot of other protections. The hallucinations are better. They incorporate search now. So it's not the same as the early ChatGPT. And this is something I want to underscore. In every workshop that I run, I just ran one yesterday for business people in the area. If you tried ChatGPT in early 2023 and you looked at it and you thought, oh, this isn't really that great, I can tell that it was written by AI. Nothing like the AI that is being produced now, the content that's being produced by generative AI now. And what's astonishing about this field, in part because there's so much capital and resources going into it, and there's so many breakthroughs in terms of the capabilities in computer science, that it is rapidly changing so that month by month you see huge differences in terms of what the capabilities are. I had a guest speaker earlier this week, a lawyer from Richmond, who came and talked to my AI in Society class, talking about AI and its impact on the legal system and the practice of law. He was referencing that one vendor came and talked to his firm in April, shared what they were able to do in terms of using generative AI for producing briefs and memos and managing content that they would have. The same vendor came back this week, just about 6 months later. The product was completely different. So even when we're talking about vendors and specific applications, because the AI models are changing so rapidly and the applications of them are changing so rapidly, one piece of advice I heard is that if you think that you have an idea about something AI could do and it doesn't do it yet, just give it a couple months. Chances are it's going to catch up. And there are a lot of businesses that are actually kind of built on that already, and they're giving that advice to entrepreneurs. Develop an idea, just wait for the AI to catch up, and it's going to be able to do some of those things. And it's changing so rapidly, you shouldn't be It's kind of like throwing a pass in football. You don't throw it to the receiver; you throw it ahead of the receiver. You lead them a little bit. We kind of have to think about all of these developments that way. We shouldn't just be thinking about what's happening now, or certainly not what was happening 6 months ago or 2 years ago. We can be creative, start thinking about what these applications look like. And I think importantly, we need to be thinking about what's likely to happen, because it's going to have serious repercussions for everything that we're doing as these developments continue to grow. And we're seeing that in economics and labor markets, and we're seeing that in the classroom. And we need to be more forward thinking than ever.
So it's a great segue to the work that you're doing, not just here on campus, because you've become a thought leader in this space with books you've written and talks you've given. You've had a lot of conversations with faculty, both here at Mary Washington, but really probably around the world, grappling with this. We are at one of those moments where we are trying to fly the plane as we build it. So could you describe some of the concerns you hear from faculty in terms of what artificial intelligence might mean to how we learn, teach, and think?
Boy, they really run the gamut. I mean, they're all over the place. I just attended a workshop last weekend. It was a symposium on AI and the liberal arts. And a good friend and I, who we co-host a podcast together, we have a lot of discussions every day about this. And we were still a little surprised by how varied the responses were. There were a number of people there, including keynote speakers, some of the speakers that were there from the plenary session, and a number of other presentations that we attended that are very forward-thinking, and they were very aware of how this is not only changing individual assignments, but it's really changing the whole nature of education. And when we talk about a lot of existential threats and challenges to higher ed, this is certainly one of them. It's not the only one, but it's certainly one that is changing the very nature of what goes on in what an education looks like. There are a number of people that are already thinking on that level. But there were many others that were still very concerned about, what does this mean for my assignment? And I get that and I understand it, but unfortunately, that's still the question that we were asking 2 or 3 years ago. We need to get everybody caught up to speed to recognize that you might be able to address that one assignment. We've got to start thinking a little broader. We have to start thinking a little bit deeper about, what does this mean for how students learn content? What does this mean for how we can personalize or individualize as a potential for individual student work? What does this mean for how we prepare them for an economy that is rapidly changing? So runs the gamut from how do we adapt and incorporate statements about AI use in the classroom and figure out what's appropriate use or not appropriate use. And I'm the first to say that's really up to the individual instructor. I'm not suggesting everybody use AI or they incorporate AI, but everybody needs to understand AI. We need a level of information literacy, AI literacy, and some fluency with AI that we really haven't seen yet. And most people really haven't been able to grapple with that yet. So even if somebody's planning on not using AI in their classroom, they better understand it well enough to know how students might try to use it, or what they're going to be doing with it, or how they might need to use it in their intended field a little bit later. So we've got to work on AI literacy and really raise that foundation first. And then we can start talking about how this is going to change the nature of our curricula, how it's going to change the nature of interactions. And I think there's a real opportunity here to not only adapt, and this is something that has been kind of a common theme for me, and I really feel a lot of optimism here. The liberal arts, at first, we were just concerned, how can we adapt? How can we try to keep up? I'm no longer worried about adapting. If we do this right, not only can we adapt, the liberal arts can lead not only education, but I think also in the development of new AI. Because so much of what's happening in artificial intelligence, and in particular generative AI, is that it's modeled after human cognition and human interaction. And that's by design, through chatbots, through agents, through the way that we would interact with those elements, but also with the development of the technology itself. It's trying to model human cognition. Neural networks are really based upon human neural networks and neural connections. There's a natural connection there, natural analogy to how AI is being developed in the way that it's trying to model and reflect what humans are able to do. Now, the intent, of course, with artificial intelligence is go beyond the capabilities of humans. And I think we'll probably get there if we're not there already when I look at some of the benchmarks. But we still need to be able to interact with and to understand those connections. And I think the liberal arts presents an opportunity to be able to do that because we've done that traditionally. It's really a return to what we've done so well traditionally. But we need to do it in a way that's inflected with an understanding of AI, an understanding of where we're going with it, and how do we apply so much of the foundation of the liberal arts so that we can do it more effectively, responsibly, and ethically.
That's great. So I too think that this is a moment in time that really is an opportunity for those of us who've been so passionate and committed to a liberal arts and sciences education. put yourself in the shoes of maybe a student who's a junior or senior in high school and their parents, maybe one of our students who's already in college and trying to think about what life is going to look like, 2, 3, 5 years from now. And as you said, things are happening so quickly. It's hard to predict what the world's going to look like 5 years from now and how artificial intelligence is going to change the way we live and work. So if you are thinking about making an investment and going to college, and you're thinking about what's going to be the return on that investment, and what should I be learning, and what skills should I be developing in the age of AI, what would you tell them?
Well, it's easy for me to imagine this because I have kids those ages. I have a daughter who's a junior in high school, a son who's a sophomore in college, 2 older kids one just finished graduate school, the other one's in graduate school. And these are the conversations we have constantly. Now, it's kind of funny because as a parent, they typically roll their eyes, Dad's talking about AI again. And for a long time, that was kind of the response. Yeah, we understand AI. But they've certainly come around to an understanding that things are changing far more rapidly than they anticipated, that there are a lot of developments there that they need to get a hold of. And they share their concerns. And I'm worried for them. And I'm worried for all of our students. So the conversation that I try to have with them is to discuss how do we move from traditional understandings of education and the economy to where we think it's moving and where we think it's going. And I feel very strongly, and this is coming from a lot of the research that I'm doing, and maybe we can even touch on that in the way that the kind of the liberal arts model through what we call AI pluralism can lead to more ethical AI development in the future. And that informs a lot of this. Part of it is also that I think that for someone to be, and this is coming from discussions I've had with people in business at a lot of conferences, people in technology, and you see a lot of articles about this, kind of a return to the humanities or classics education is what's important for an AI world. And part of that is because it's not as much, for a long time, it was about mastery of a particular domain, and you develop your niche, and you go really deep in that one area. And for academics, that's what we do. That's what your doctorate is all about, is trying to find a specific area that you are an expert in, perhaps better than most people in your country or in the world. That's obviously still important. It's great to have that drive to be able to work in that area. But when we have a tool like artificial intelligence that at this stage not only can match the work that I could do in my doctoral field, but that same model can do that in other fields as well. That really changes the nature of education. That kind of changes then my understanding of, do I need to go quite as deep? Now, I'm not saying people shouldn't, and I'm encouraging my students to find something they're passionate about, and my kids find something they're passionate and go deep on this. But how do you also leverage that tool then to be able to do that much more? So at the very least, and I think an initial step, and we're already seeing that this is what business leaders are calling for, and it's largely what they've been calling for decades. They want students, they want workers that have strong, durable skills. These are the communication skills, critical thinking, research, collaboration skills, and now I would also add management and leadership skills too, that businesses have always said that they are looking for and that the liberal arts produces in spades. I mean, that's really the foundation of what we do. When we have general education requirements and we have writing and speaking across the curriculum, we have digital studies, we incorporate writing and research and critical reflection into our FSEM. That's because we've known for decades, well, for millennia, that that's really important to any kind of academic enterprise. And that's what employers are saying they need now, and technology leaders are saying we're going to need going forward. Because think about this, if we're going to be interacting with a new technology that is modeled after human interaction, we need to be able to interact with that technology. You can't do that very well if you don't have strong communication skills, written and oral communication skills. A higher education degree, experience in college, is the best way to be able to develop those skills, to have that facility. Now, that also presumes that we're doing it in a way that is going to prepare them for that kind of interaction, because it's a little different interacting with the chatbot than it is with another person. I think that what we're already finding is that the workers that are most successful, that are most sought after now, and that there's every indication for many years are going to be sought after, are going to have those foundational skills, but will be able to manage not only other people, because they'll have teams of humans working with AI agents, AI workflows. And managing that workflow is very similar to managing another person. So we see some of the disruption in the labor market right now. You see a lot of cutbacks or reductions in the number of people hired at the lower levels, because some of that kind of grunt work or repetitive work can be done and automated easily. Sometimes at the upper end, they're not retaining those people because they don't really have the same value add. Mid-level managers are incredibly important. They have the institutional knowledge, they have some experience, they can manage people, and they can work with teams. That level of collaboration is incredibly important. And one thing that resonates with me is that's really what the academic enterprise is about. It's about having a community of learners and educators that can get together and discuss ideas, test ideas, and work together collaboratively. I think the best return on investment is an education that provides students with that opportunity. So I don't know that when I talk to my own kids, I try to guide them that yes, you still want to develop expertise in a particular area, and that's still going to be sought after, but make sure you're seeking out an educational opportunity where you have that in-person or at least synchronous interaction with other humans in discussions about how you can apply those skills within an ever-changing disciplinary landscape. And every field is adapting in this way. And if we have those durable skills and we can inflect it with an understanding of AI literacy and application of some of these AI tools, I think they're all going to be better off. And that's certainly where I'm guiding my kids. The last thing I would add to this is that I think we need to really encourage a sense of entrepreneurship for every student. And too often we kind of push that over to the business school. And there's some schools that have done a good job of thinking about entrepreneurial humanities. We need this in every area. And part of it isn't, maybe it's that we want them to be entrepreneurs, that's great, but you need entrepreneurial thinking to be able to have your own sense of agency in the way that you're using a lot of the tools and to think creatively about what you can do with them. I think that sense of self-learning, of self-drive, intrinsic motivation is going to be key. It's going to be absolutely essential to success in an AI world because otherwise, if you are not internally motivated, it's going to be really hard to know what to do. If the tool can do a lot of the very basic work you'd be doing, you should be thinking a little further about how can I leverage this to my own benefit? How can I use this to benefit my community? And what can I do really creatively?
So I'm going to put my faculty hat on. It's been a while since I've been a full-time faculty, but I'll put it on, and I've had several conversations with your colleagues and multiple concerns about artificial intelligence. As you mentioned earlier, I'll put them in a couple buckets just to oversimplify. One is a concern about cheating, and which I'm sure you've heard a lot, is that artificial intelligence is now going to be used by students to create product, and it's not their own work. Then the other, related to that, is that we're outsourcing a lot of our thinking, that we now have machines that can solve problems for us and produce knowledge for us. And so how do I, as a faculty member, I take your point that, yeah, we have to prepare students for a world that's infused with artificial intelligence, and we have to develop their critical thinking skills and encourage them to be creative and entrepreneurial. But how do I do that responsibly? How do I develop their critical thinking skills when I'm concerned that we're actually outsourcing a lot of that thinking now to a machine?
Excellent questions and concerns. Let me take them in turn in order. So when I think about my own experience over the last 30 plus years teaching, and I remember the first class I ever taught was an argumentation and debate class in 1992. At that time, teaching argumentation and debate incorporated a lot of research. That stage, it was still card catalogs, and it was still citation indexes and doing work in the library. And I remember at the time, as some of these digital tools were being introduced, where you would be able to search something on a CD-ROM, or eventually when the World Wide Web was actually invented and implemented, and there were a number of colleagues that were very concerned, wait a minute, they're not really learning how to research. They're losing out on these practices that we've had for decades, if not hundreds of years, decades and centuries. What are we doing? Why are we giving this up? The lawyer that came to my class this week showed a picture of a bunch of books in his office. He said, I used to use books. I don't use books anymore. They're there for aesthetic benefit. It looks nice, but I don't really open books. I do it all electronically. So we need to recognize that academic practices always change because of the introduction of new technology. Even if you go back to the early 1800s, chalkboards were introduced, and that was revolutionary. So it's not exactly the same, of course. I mean, this is happening a lot faster. It's more disruptive. It's a very different nature of technology that's being introduced, but we should recognize that there are changes. Changes have occurred before. I remember having to cite which database you would get an article from, whether it was EBSCO or LexisNexis for a time, and then we dropped that practice because it didn't really make a lot of sense. I remember a time when you were concerned whether or not someone was using a spell check, and now, of course, you would use it. I can't imagine a student turning in a paper to me that hasn't used spell. Why would I want to read a misspelled word when you have this tool that's available to you? I also think of examples like calculators. I remember taking calculus when I was a student in the 1980s, and we didn't really, I guess we used calculators sometimes, but we didn't have very capable calculators. And I remember when my son was taking AP Calc and he was getting ready for the AP test, he didn't have one, he had two. He was taught by his teacher to use two graphing calculators so that one could run an answer while the other one was being programmed. And when I look at that, I'm thinking, oh, did he miss out? Well, it's possible. You could outsource that work to the calculator, just plug it in and get the answer. But he was able to do a lot more advanced work in calculus than I was able to do during that same amount of time. There's certainly the risk that we're outsourcing our thinking, or that you could outsource your thinking. But this kind of ties both concerns together, because I think the appeal that I try to make to students, and in the Intro to AI class that I taught this summer, there was a section on academic integrity. And we want to be very mindful about that. How do we define academic integrity? That has changed based on different technologies. It's based on different norms and expectations and what we should be doing. Of course, they need to talk to their instructors about what's allowed, what's not allowed, and how do I do this responsibly. And I want to be very transparent. Everybody should be very transparent about those practices. But more importantly, I want to be able to motivate the students to think, okay, if I just outsource it, what do I get out of this? And obviously, they're cheating themselves if they're just outsourcing the work. It's just like if they had some friend write a paper for them instead of having ChatGPT, they're cheating themselves in that educational process. The other appeal, though, that I make to them is that if all you can really do is take my assignment and put it in ChatGPT and turn in the result, what are you going to tell the employer that when they ask you how are you going to use AI, they say, oh, well, I'll take the work the email you sent me, I'll put it in ChatGPT and I'll then send you the work. Why would they hire you? They could do the same thing. They could automate that and it would be a lot faster and a lot easier. So it's always important for them to think about what's the value add? What am I getting out of this? I mean, they should be thinking about their own return of investment on their education. And if they really are motivated by that, then they should be thinking about how can I get the most out of this assignment? What can I do with this? And they should be given the opportunity in many instances, I wouldn't say in every instance, but many instances, to use some of the best and newest technology in order to do that if it makes sense in their discipline and it makes sense in the kind of work that they're doing. Students still need to learn how to write. I don't want students in 5th grade to start using generative AI to be able to write their papers for them. They should learn how to write well because they need to be able to write prompts. They need to be able to interact with chatbots. They need to be able to write emails and be able to write memos for people. And they shouldn't just rely on a tool or technology that could perhaps not work or not work the way they would like it to. They need that foundational skill. And so part of it is that I think we really need to reflect on what do we mean by academic integrity, because tools change. They do change the nature of the work that we have. And that's something we need to be intentional about. So at the very least, we need to have that conversation. When is it allowed, when is it not allowed, and why? And if it is allowed, then it's not cheating by definition. If I tell my students, I have a class next semester, argumentation that I've taught for 30 plus years, and not only are they allowed to, they are pretty much required to use it. And I want to teach them the best ways to use it, to use the best deep research reviews and produce these reports, because I've done this volunteer with my daughter's debate team. It is amazing when students are able to use it responsibly, and then they go into the debate and they have to debate those arguments. Instead of working down here at a very rudimentary level and kind of just scratching the surface on the topics, I want them to jump way up to master's level, expertise in this subject area, and they can do it with these tools. So if I see that they can use it to leverage that tool, leverage the technology to be able to do better work, better quality work, to be able to do more work, then I don't think they're just outsourcing the cognitive work. I think that they're figuring out how can they do this to supplement their own work. They can extend their own capabilities. And that's the discussion we need to be able to have. The other aspect of this that I try to remind faculty is that we're finding this in business too. It's easy to say, hey, it's just banned. You can't use it here. There are a lot of businesses that say, hey, you're not supposed to use it. Unfortunately, people are using it. And if we don't have if we're not honest with ourselves and with our students and with our employees about there are these capabilities, and if we tell you it's prohibited and you're going to use it anyway, then we open up a whole other can of worms in terms of liability and privacy and content that is really inappropriate and irresponsible. So it's not to say that because they're going to use it, we necessarily need to integrate it. I think we need to have a better justification than that. But it's also not so easy anymore to simply say, well, I've banned it and it's never going to come into my classroom. It is. Let's have discussions with students about when you want them to use it, when you don't want them to use it, and why. And I think that students really appreciate that. Students are using AI because they see the changes that are coming. They understand it better than we do. And they want to be able to figure out how can they be better prepared. So I don't accept that they're just looking for a way to cheat. There are always people that are looking for a way to cheat, and we try to deter that, and we should deter that. But other students are trying to do it because they realize this is what they need to be able to do in the workplace, and we have a responsibility to prepare them for that.
I love the fact that I'll reference him again. He's my chief of staff, Dr. McClurkin, is teaching a class on history of technology this semester, and he's probably one of those faculty members like you who's been very forward thinking about how to integrate technology into his pedagogy, into his classroom. But it's been a long time since he went and actually purchased blue books using Blue Books in his history of technology class. And so that was, I know that faculty are looking for different approaches in terms of how to both use AI, but also continue to develop those critical thinking skills. I have a couple sort of more global questions for you, and then we'll close out with what is now going to be my standard question for all my guests. But I know both here on campus and across the country and across the world, there is concern about the environmental impact of artificial intelligence.
Absolutely.
All these data centers that are popping up to support this new technology. How should we think our way through this, trying to be responsible to the environment while also understanding that AI is here and isn't going anywhere?
An incredibly important question. And part of this is about reflective practice. And we've had these discussions on campus. We're trying to encourage more discussions like this on campus. We held a public debate, and two faculty, Caitlin Heinel in communication and Mike Reno in philosophy, were willing to come forward and debate whether or not AI will have a negative impact on the environment over the coming years. And it was a great public debate because we couldn't resolve it. It's because we want to raise awareness. And we really need to think about what this means. Now, I would look at it from a couple of different perspectives. The one perspective, and I've heard from some students and from some faculty and members of the community, that I'm not going to use AI because of data centers. Well, we also have to recognize data centers have been here for quite a while, and we're all reliant on data centers already. So our Canvas, the learning management systems in a data center, our emails in a data center, we're streaming Netflix movies that are all provided by data centers. So it's not as easy to say, well, I'm going to avoid this technology so I don't have to worry about environmental implications. We already have those environmental impacts. So let's be honest about current practices that we already have. That's not to suggest that that means it's okay to just ramp up AI and use it for any indiscriminate purpose because we already did it. It's not unique to the concern. It's just that let's be open about this. Let's make sure that we're informed about what current practices are. The other thing we need to do is have open and honest discussions and debate about this because it can pressure the companies to be more transparent about those practices. There was a long time where people were asking questions and the companies were not very forthcoming with how much energy is really used when I do a ChatGPT query or how much water is being used to cool that data center. And so you would hear stories where somebody would approximate and you'd say, I remember a story a year ago, every time you do a ChatGPT query, it's like pouring out a bottle of water. Now, that is possible in a data center that's not being very responsible with its resources. I invited somebody from Stack Infrastructure, a UMW graduate, Kevin Hughes, came to my class a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about some of these practices and how do they try to build data centers responsibly and to encourage responsible practices. And he was a leader with his company to be able to build a data center campus locally that uses gray water that's non-potable, and then be able to recycle it so that it would have a more minimal impact on the environment. So that's not to say that it's okay then to just use it for any indiscriminate purpose, but let's be thoughtful about those practices. We should also then think about, okay, this is a limited resource, and we are increasing capabilities, and we're trying to think about new applications. Maybe you don't always have to just run a query for something if it's not that important, or you could just find it through a simple Google search because you can just recall the information instead of generating it. So I think part of this is just an ongoing discussion about a lot of implications. The same thing with copyright. There are concerns about copyright and what does that mean for the way we're envisioning copyright. We should be aware of these issues. We should be involved in public debate so that we can help spur on better regulation, better corporate practices, and then we can make individual decisions about what we think is appropriate or inappropriate to use. In the same way that we should probably be thinking about, do we run air conditioning at a certain temperature in our house? Or how far do we drive with a gas-powered car if we really don't have to, or could we carpool instead? These are all questions that we should be asking, and the way you start with it is to make sure you're better informed. And that's one of the things that we really want to make sure we're doing with the center, is to be able to have those conversations, to be able to inform that discussion, and then spur on that discussion. I don't have an answer for each individual because each individual needs to come up with their own practice and their own understanding, but they can't do it until they're informed about it.
Well, thank you so much. You help this community engage in important issues that are affecting our lives. And I remember you put together during COVID a class that allowed the broader Mary Washington community to sort of grapple and better understand what was going on in that moment in time. And you've done the same thing at this moment in time as we're all trying to grapple with artificial intelligence. And you offered a class this summer
That's right,
for our current students and our new incoming students for free to help them better understand artificial intelligence, but also how they might be able to use it ethically and responsibly in their education. And so I just want to express my appreciation for you helping this community grapple with these very challenging but also exciting issues that we go through in real time. So I want to use that as a segue to ask my last question that I am going to be asking really all of my guests. And that is, at this point in time, here in 2025, as you think about where you are, both professionally but in your life, and thinking about the world we're in right now, what are three things that matter most to you?
Well, that's a great question. And being one of the early guests, I didn't get to hear other people answer this. So this is
You're
really
on the
putting me
spot.
on the spot. That's great. What three things matter to me the most, I think, especially professionally, is that I really want to help my colleagues, work with my colleagues to figure out how does UMW address the current needs, this exigence that we're facing with the disruption of AI throughout society. And I think there's some things that we can do to go back to the basics within our curricula, within our general education curriculum that are really important. But I think one of the most important elements of that is that we need to bring to the forefront an understanding and study of evaluation and judgment. I want to make sure students really can evaluate the output coming from AI, that they can make judgments about what it is that they're looking for, what they're trying to get it to do, so that they don't lose their agency. Because it would be too easy to become complacent, to think, well, it's so good, it must be good enough. I'll just outsource that. I'll have it write my emails for me, have it write my paper for me, or memos. And you see this happening in business places, or lawyers sometimes relying on it to a great extent when they really shouldn't be. I don't want to lose that sense of agency. And I think that's probably the key element of all of the work that we want to do with the center, is to be able to maintain that and build it. I think that's incredibly important. I think secondly, I want to continue to learn. I think what most important to me is that I want to model for my students that it's about being intrinsically motivated to be able to continue to learn, to recognize that there are real limits in terms of what we already know. Don't become complacent in terms of outsourcing the work, but also don't be complacent about your own betterment. Try to develop yourself, to continue to learn, and I love that. It's always really fun, and I love bringing those examples back into the classroom. And I think the third item that is really consistent with the theme of the whole discussion that we've had is about community. I want to make sure that we're maintaining, and that I'm maintaining those relationships, that we're building those relationships. I think it's become too easy because of other technological developments like social media to become siloed, to become separate from others, to feel like we're engaging when we're really just doing it through a device. And I try to remind myself and those people that I'm close to that we need to make sure that we're together, that we're spending time together, and we're spending time with people that we don't agree with. I learn a lot more from that. And I think so much of what our society is going to be dependent upon is finding ways to break down some of those barriers, get out of those silos, and that's going to help us navigate some of these changes better than anything else.
Well, Anand Rao, thank you so much for joining me today, taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to share with me some of really amazing thoughts on an issue that we're all grappling with. I could talk to you probably for another 3 or 4 hours. That's fascinating. I think we just scratched the surface. But thank you so much for being here today, and good luck as you continue to grapple with these important issues.
Thanks so much for having me. And I look forward to welcoming members of the community to other events that we're going to be holding on campus. This is the time for community.